Hello everyone, this week we are going to learn demand and supply and applications and extensions using demand and supply. Let's first start with the resource markets. There is a link between resource and product markets. Markets for resources and products are closely linked. When we say resource market, these are the resources that businesses need to produce goods and services. In the resource market, businesses demand resources while households supply them. Firms demand resources in order to produce goods and services. Households supply them to earn income. For example, labor market is an important resource market. Households supply labor hours and businesses demand labor hours in the market. An increase in the demand for a product will lead to an increase in demand for the resources used to produce it. For instance, if there is an increase in demand for Starbucks coffee, then we will see more Starbucks stores around the corners. So therefore, the Starbucks is going to demand for labor. Therefore, there is going to be an increase in the resource demand. In contrast, a reduction in the demand for a product will lead to a reduction in the demand for resources used to produce it. And also, an increase in the price of a resource will increase the cost of producing products that use it, shifting their supply curve to the left. And when there is a shift of the supply curve to the left, there is going to be a reduction in the supply of the production, and therefore the prices of that product or service is going to increase in the market, and there's going to be less goods and services produced in the market. A reduction in resource prices will have the opposite effect. Let's see this with an example. Suppose there is a reduction in the supply of young workers that pushes restaurant waiters and waitress wages up. So the supply, as you see on the screen, shifts to the left. So this is what? This is the supply of waitress and waitress. And when it shifts to the left, the wages of waiters and waitresses increase from $8 to $10. And at that price, remember that in the product market, which is the restaurant meals, there is going to be a shift of the supply curve to the left, increases the prices of restaurant meals to $12, which is what happens today, right? Because of the Great Resignation, restaurants cannot find workers to work in the restaurant. Therefore, they are increasing their meal prices. And we see an increase in the price in the restaurant meals because of the increase in resource prices. Now, the next topic we will talk about today is the economics of price controls. So, if you remember that in the free markets, there is no government intervention to the market. Demand and supply determines the price and the quantity. So buyers and sellers in a decentralized way buy and sell goods and services, and that decentralized decision-making process affects the price of the goods and services. In the price controls, actually, government interferes with the markets and sets maximum and minimum prices in the market. So let's start with the first price control, which is price ceiling. A price ceiling establishes a maximum price that sellers are legally permitted to charge. Example is rent control. Let's think about one example, which is your discussion this week. New York apartments. New York apartments, let's say, without price control, $10,000 a month. And because of price control, you pay $2,000. You see, there's going to be a huge difference. So you cannot charge $3,000 because this is the maximum price. 2K is the maximum price in the market. So the idea here is actually to support the renters, right? Because they may suffer from paying 10K, it's very high. So therefore the government's intention is good, to protect people who rent apartments in New York. When a price ceiling keeps the price of a good below market equilibrium, there will be both direct and indirect effect. So this is the market equilibrium 10K, and 2K is below the market equilibrium. So the intentions are good, but the results may not be good because of price control. Let's see the direct effect. Direct effect of price control is the shortage. The quantity demanded will exceed the quantity supplied. You might see people are waiting in the line to get the limited rent-controlled apartments. Indirect effects, quality deterioration and changes in other non-price factors favorable to sellers and unfavorable to buyers are likely to occur. So if you are a landlord and you know that your place is worth it 10K but you just get 2K, you may stop improving the apartment. So that is the quality deterioration. And other non-price factors could be, we will talk about in the following slides, but sellers start rationing the buyers. So what does that mean? There might be even some discrimination, because if you know that there are too many buyers in the market, you start choosing between the buyers. You may be more favorable to friends and family, or even to certain races. The quantity exchange will fall at the end of this price ceiling, and the gains from trade will be less than if the goods were allocated by markets. Let's see this example, impact of a price ceiling. This is here, as you see, is the apartment's price, let's say 10K with the free markets. But because government impose a price ceiling, that means this is the maximum price in the market. You can't charge higher than this. And at that price, this much apartments is supplied to the market. Landlord might say it's too low, I'm not even renting the apartment, it's not worth it. So some of the landlords will say no rental places, therefore quantity supplied is going to be here. But look where the quantity demanded is, there are lines waiting for the rental apartments. This creates a shortage because quantity demanded is much more than quantity supplied. Because prices are not allowed to direct the market to equilibrium, non-price factors will become more important in determining where the scarce goods go. So let's see this non-price factors. At the end of the rent control, shortages and black markets will develop. These are illegal markets, right? Under the table negotiations. The future supply of housing will decline. So there's not going to be new construction, because even the developers know that the rental price of the apartment is very low. The quality of housing will deteriorate. Non-price methods of rationing will increase in importance, inefficient use of housing will result, and long-term renters will benefit at the expense of newcomers, because long-term renters are not going to leave the apartment because they know that they cannot find a place that much cheap. Therefore, newcomers are going to suffer because of long-term renters. Now let's talk about another policy, which is price floor. This is the minimum price, minimum legal price. This time the government wants to support sellers, sets a minimum price. And one good example of price floor is the minimum wage. So the companies who demand for labor cannot pay below the minimum wage to the workers. So this is, again, intention is good. Government wants to actually help the people who are living in the poverty level. Minimum wage is paid for low-skilled labor, remember, or no-skilled labor. Low-skill, let's write it like that. When a price floor keeps the price of a good above the market equilibrium, it will lead to both direct and indirect effects. So let's say market equilibrium is maybe $6, but minimum wage is $10. Therefore, the minimum wage affects the market equilibrium. The direct effect is surplus. Sellers will want to supply a larger quantity than buyers are willing to purchase. Indirect effects, changes in non-price factors favorable to buyers and unfavorable to sellers. The quantity exchange will fall and the gains from trade will be less than if the goods were allocated by markets. Let's see this example. Let's say here P1 is $15 an hour and P0 is $7 an hour. Okay? So this is the case for any state in the United States. So if P1, low-skilled labor, if the government imposes $15 an hour, look what happens. The quantity demanded is here. That means this is the businesses that are looking for labor, and here is the supply of labor. So what happens here? If that is the case, there is going to be more people looking for the job than the job openings the businesses have. What business can do? Businesses actually ration the situation, right? How? By replacing workers with the machines. So this might be the case why they don't demand that much labor compared to the equilibrium price. So this creates a surplus. Surplus means unemployment. Because prices are not allowed to direct the market equilibrium, non-price factors will become more important in the allocation of the good. And remember that this much of labor is going to be higher. And before it is this much at the equilibrium. That is the situation we say that this is not efficient. Why? Because you might have actually more laborers are hired in the market compared to price floor. So what are these non-price factors? Reduction in the non-wage components of compensation. So companies might pay you $15, but they may reduce the health benefits or retirement benefits. And there's going to be less on the job training because companies are trying to save money on the job training, and may encourage students to drop out of school. So if you see that the companies are paying $15 minimum wage, then you might say, I'm not going to go to school anymore and work for minimum wage. So the direct effect is reduces employment of low-skilled labor. Remember, there's going to be unemployment and the people are hired at that wage drops down. Now here, consider the market for low-skilled labor, which we have done already. And in this example, equilibrium wage is 7, but minimum wage is set to 10. So nothing is allowed below. And that is going to create an excess supply. A minimum wage of $10 would increase the wages of low-skilled labor, but employment will decline from E0 to E1. Those who lose their jobs will be pushed into either unemployment or less preferred employment. The basic postulate of economics indicates that a higher minimum wage will reduce the employment of low-skilled workers. But research indicates that each 10% increase in the minimum wage will reduce employment by between 1 to 2%. Because the wage increases are substantially larger than the reductions in employment, a higher minimum wage will nearly always increase the total earnings of low-skilled workers. And proponents of minimum wages believe that the higher total earnings are worth the reductions in employment. Does the minimum wage help the poor? Depends. Actually, we need to understand who are these minimum wage earners, right? It looks like a higher minimum wage would reduce poverty, but this view is questionable. While a higher minimum wage increases the wages of low-skilled workers, their on-the-job training, non-wage benefits, working conditions, and employment will decline. Who are the minimum wage workers? More than 80% are members of households with incomes above the poverty level. So they are not the families in the poverty, below poverty level. About 1/2 are between the ages of 16 and 24 years. Approximately 3/5 are working part-time. Only 15% are a sole earner providing support for a family with 1 or more children. Now let's a little bit talk about black markets and the importance of the legal structure. So what is a black market? Black market is a market that operates outside the legal system. The primary sources of black markets are evasion of a price control. So if there's a price control, then you might want to sell it under the table. That's called black market. Evasion of a tax, high excise taxes on cigarettes, then you might see that there is a black market for cigarettes. Legal prohibition on the production and exchange of a good, prostitution, marijuana, and cocaine. Black markets have a higher incidence of defective products, higher profit rates, and greater use of violence to resolve the disputes. So let's say you buy something in the black market and the product is defective. You can't do anything. You need to use violence to resolve the disputes because you can't go to court and ask for your rights. So a legal system is very important in that perspective, and a legal system provides secure property rights and unbiased enforcement of the contracts, enhances the operation of markets. Markets will exist in any environment, but they can be counted on to function efficiently only when property rights are secure and contracts enforced in an even-handed manner. The next topic we are going to discuss is the impact of a tax. Tax incidence, the legal assignment of who pays a tax, is called the statutory incidence. But the actual burden of a tax, actually who pays the tax, may differ substantially. So the actual burden does not depend on who legally pays the tax. So who legally pays the tax is the statutory incidence. Actual incidence, who actually pays the tax, okay? These are two different things. So let's see the impact of a tax imposed on sellers. As you see here, it says sellers. So sellers legally are required to pay the tax. But let's see what sellers do when there is a tax imposed on the used car. Consider the used car market where a price of $7,000 would bring the quantity of used cars demanded into balance with the quantity supply. So without tax, we are here. 750K cars are sold at a price of $7,000 on average. When a 1,000 tax is imposed on the sellers of used cars, the supply of the used cars is going to shift upward or to the left as much as the tax. So the supply shifts $1,000 to the left. The new price for the used cars is going to be here, intersection of the demand curve and the supply curve, which is 7,400. So what is happening here? When the sellers see that the government imposes a tax in the market, they are going to change this price, right? They are going to change the price they sell the car in the market. They are going to ask higher prices. But maybe they cannot ask all the tax that they have to pay to the government. So the market price 7,000 and they cannot ask maybe 8,000 because they may not find anybody who's buying the car at 8,000. But they are going to reflect as much as they can. They are going to reflect the tax on the price as much as they can. In this case, they reflect 400 more. So the new price of the cars used same car because of the tax increases to 7,400. Remember, before the tax, sellers were getting 7,000. Now they are getting 7,400. But they have to pay $1,000 to the government, right? So for that reason, they are actually getting 6,400. So they are selling the car here, 7,400, but they need to pay 1,000 to the government tax, and the price they get, effective price, is 6,400. So this is with tax. Sellers what tax with the tax they get. If sellers without tax, they were getting 7,000. So you see the difference now, 6,400. They actually pay 600 of the tax. What happened to remaining 400? 400 is paid by the buyers. So buyers before paying 7,000 for the same car, but now paying 7,400. So 400 comes from the buyer's pocket. So as you see, tax burden is distributed among sellers and buyers. Sellers, although are required to pay $1,000, they are not paying all of the tax. So the statutory tax is on sellers, but the burden of tax is 600 on sellers and 400 on buyers. With the new quantity of used cars, which is 500K, you are here, because now here the new equilibrium. And without the tax, it's 750K. So consumers bear $400, right? This is the consumers. You can find a tax like that, tax incidence. Find the equilibrium point, okay? And then from the equilibrium line, you see here, go up, and this is how much the buyers pay, 400. How do I find 7,400 minus 7,000? And for the sellers, from this, go down to the supply. This is how much sellers pay, which is 7,000 minus 6,400, it's 600. Now let's calculate how much tax in total buyers are paying. 400 is the length of the tax, or the tax they pay for one car, but there are 500K cars are sold. So 400 times 500K, 200 million is the tax, or the red hedge area is the tax that buyers are paying to the government. Let's find out how much tax in total sellers are paying. Per car they are paying 600 and 500 cars are sold. So the blue hedge area, 600 times 500, which is 300 million, tax is paid from sellers for a total of 500 million. As only 500,000 cars are sold after the tax instead of 750K, the yellow area, here you see the yellow area, above the old supply curve and below the demand curve represents the consumer and producer surplus lost from levying of the tax, called deadweight loss. So why is deadweight loss? Because there is a guy here, okay, who want to buy a used car below 7,400, but since sellers are okay to accept before the price of 7,000, because of the tax they don't accept, and there's a seller here, there's a seller. This transaction didn't happen, right? These transactions didn't happen because the new price is 7,400. But if you just let the market do the job, free market, these transactions are going to go until the equilibrium. Therefore, this yellow area represents the deadweight loss. So 250K cars are not sold That is the deadweight loss. Now let's think about this time a tax imposed on buyers instead of sellers. Okay, when a 1000 tax is imposed on buyers of used cars, the demand curve shifts vertically downward as much as the tax. So here, demand curve shifts $1,000 down. The new price for the used cars is going to be $6,400 because now the buyers are not going to pay $7,000, the free market price. They are going to pay less because they have more cost. They have to pay tax to the government. Buyers then pay taxes of $1,000, making the after-tax price $7,400. So in the market, they buy the used car at $6,400, and on top of that, they pay the tax. So they pay total $7,400 for the used car. So again, we can calculate the tax incidence. Remember, this is the equilibrium price. Anything from here to up to the demand curve is the tax paid by buyers, which is $400, and anything below to the supply curve is paid by the sellers, $600, because now sellers are receiving $6,400, but they were receiving $7,000, so $600 of the tax goes from seller's pocket. So as you see, doesn't matter who pays the tax, buyers or sellers. So I can say that statutory status of the tax doesn't matter. The important thing is that either you impose a tax on sellers or the buyers, the tax burden is shared. In this case, $400 paid by buyers and $600 is paid by sellers. So the new quantity of used cars that clears the market is 500. Consumers bear 400 of the tax burden. And the same, as you see, the same picture, nothing has changed, just the equilibrium price is different. And this area represents the tax paid by buyers, total tax, and this area represents the tax paid by sellers, total tax, and the yellow area represents the deadweight loss. The incidence of the tax is the same. This is the important part. The incidence of the tax represents who pays how much, is the same regardless of whether it's imposed on buyers or sellers. The deadweight loss of taxation is the loss of the gains from trade as a result of the imposition of a tax. It imposes a burden of taxation over and above the burden of transferring revenues to the government. It is composed of losses to both buyers and sellers. The deadweight loss of taxation is sometimes referred to as the excess burden of the tax. There is a relation between incidence of tax, when I say incidence of tax, who pays how much, and elasticity of demand and supply. The actual burden of a tax depends on the elasticity of supply relative to the demand. A supply becomes more inelastic. Remember, inelastic means more price insensitive. Okay, these people don't care about price that much. More of the burden will fall on sellers and resource suppliers. So the inelastic pays a higher percentage of the tax burden. A demand becomes more inelastic, more of the burden will fall on buyers. Let's see two examples here, gasoline market and luxury boat market. In gasoline market, demand is inelastic. Why? Because you need to drive your car to work or to school even if the gas prices increase today. So in the short run, you don't make too many adjustments. You might maybe save from couple trips to a grocery store, but still you have to consume some gas. Therefore, demand is inelastic, but supply is elastic. Look what happens with the 50 cents tax on gasoline suppliers. The new price in the market is $3. Okay, but it is $2.60 before. So 40 cents goes from buyer's pocket. And because 50 cents the suppliers need to pay to the government, out of this $3, effective price they receive is $2.50. So how do we find the tax burden? First, find this equilibrium price right here. And anything above here to the demand curve is paid by the buyers. So from $2.60 to $3.40. And anything from here down to supply curve is paid by sellers, which is from $2.60 to $2.50, 10 cents. So 10 cents of the tax paid by sellers and 40 cents is paid by buyers. Total tax is 50 cents. Now look at luxury boat market. Luxury boat market, the demand is very elastic. Why? Because it's luxury, you don't need it. buyers can buy other luxury goods. They can substitute with other luxury goods, or they can even buy boat from Caribbeans or Europe. For that reason, if there is a tax 25K on luxury boats, look what happens. Because the demand is almost flat, very flat, most of the tax is paid by sellers, even if it's imposed on buyers. So what happens here? Again, we find the equilibrium price without tax. It's here. And anything above here to the demand curve is paid by buyers, which is 5K. And anything below here down is paid by sellers, which is 20K. As you see, the elastic side pays more of the total tax. Now let's talk about tax rates, tax revenues, and the Laffer curve. Average tax rate equals tax liability divided by tax income. So if you are paying 3K total tax out of your 30K annual income, then your average tax rate is 10%. How do we find 3 divided by 30, which is equal to 1 over 10 or 0.1, multiply by 100 to find a percentage 10%. A progressive tax is one in which the average tax rate rises with income. So you earn 30K this year, you pay 10% of your income, 3K, to the government. But let's say your income increases to 50K and you pay 12% of your income. So in that case, your average tax rate increases. That's called progressive tax. A proportional tax is one in which the average tax rate stays the same across income levels. 30K, you pay 10% of your income. 50K, you earn again, you pay 10%. 100K, you earn again 10%, that is proportional tax. You are always paying 10% of your income. What is a regressive tax? Regressive tax is one in which the average tax rate falls with income. So let's say you earn 30K, 10% of your income. If you earn 50K, you pay 8% of your income. You see, the average tax rate is falling with the income. A marginal tax rate is calculated as the change in tax liability divided by the change in taxable income. Marginal tax rate is highly important because it determines how much of an additional dollar earned must be paid in taxes, and therefore how much one gets to keep. In this way, the marginal tax rate directly impacts an individual's incentive to earn. So let's say you earn $100 more this month, and how much of this additional income, change in income, you pay as tax is the marginal tax rate. If you pay $25 of this additional income to tax, then your marginal tax rate at this tax bracket is 25%. So let's see one example. This is an excerpt from the 2015 federal income tax table. And when you look at the table, you see that a single individual earns from $38,000 to $38,100. So it's a $100 increase in income. So how do we find? We subtract 38 from 38,100, and that is $100 increase in income. Look how much your tax increases. 5,300 to 5,325, $25. So your marginal tax rate is how much you pay out of this additional income. In this case, it's 25%. How do we find? $25 you pay additionally more tax divided by additional income, which is 25%. What is the individual's average income tax rate? So you can calculate here what percentage of the income this individual is paying tax, which is 5,300 divided by 38,000. This is the average tax rate, and this is the average tax rate when person increases 5,325 divided by 38,100. And if you multiply these numbers by 100, you will find the percentage. Let's calculate the first one. 5,300 divided by 38,000. 13.94. This is 13.94. Let's calculate here this case. This time you pay 5,325. 5,325 divided by 38,100. And this time your average tax rate is increased to 38.97. This is a progressive tax. Why? Because when you earn 38,000, your average tax rate is 13.94%. But now your income increases 38,100 and your tax amount increases to 5,325, which represents 13.97%. So the percentage or average tax rate is increasing as you earn more. We have more definitions here. Tax rate defined as the rate, percentage at which an activity is taxed. Tax base, on the other hand, the level or quantity of an economic activity that is taxed. It can be income, right? Your income is your tax base. Note, higher tax rates reduce the level of the tax base because they make the activity less attractive. So if the tax rate increases from 30%, let's say, to 70%, maybe some of you say that it's not worth to work. I can just stay at home and instead of paying money to the government, right? So that means when you have tax rates are getting higher, your tax base, which is your income for people all around the country, going to go down because that activity becomes less attractive. Tax revenues defined as the tax rate multiplied by the tax base. The Laffer curve illustrates the relationship between tax rates and tax revenues. And Dr. Laffer says that as tax rates increase from low levels, tax revenues will also increase even though the tax base is shrinking. So when the tax rates are increasing from 0 to up to some level, tax revenues are going to increase. Remember, what is tax revenue? Tax revenue is tax, which is the percentage, times tax base, let's say your income. So when this tax rate increases from 10%, let's say, to 15%, although some people give up working, we see an increase in tax revenue, total tax collected from the tax base. As rates continue to increase, at some point, the shrinkage in the tax base will dominate and the higher rates will lead to a reduction in tax revenues. So he also argues that if you increase tax rates after a point, then the tax base will dominate the shrinkage in the tax base and higher rates will lead to a reduction in tax revenues. The Laffer curve shows that the tax revenues are low for both high and low tax rate. Let's see this curve. This is the Laffer curve. So it says that if you are point A, the tax rate is low, therefore the tax revenue is low. But if you are in point C, tax revenue is low is not because of the tax rate. Tax rate is high. It's like above 75%. But since the tax base is shrinking, tax base, that means people are thinking the tax rate is too high, I'm not going to work anymore. So the number of people working and providing tax revenue to the government shrinks. Therefore, tax revenue again low. So we need to find the optimal point. He says that there is an optimal point that you can get highest tax with the tax rate. So increasing tax rates is not going to be a solution, or decreasing the tax rate is not going to be a solution to increase the government revenue. There should be an optimal level where you can get the optimal revenue for a given tax base and the tax rate. So given this figure, B is the ideal tax rate, only that B maximizes tax revenue in the current period. Laffer curve and tax changes in the 1980s. During the 1980s, the top federal marginal income tax rate fell from 70% to 33%. It is important to distinguish between changes in tax rates and changes in tax revenues. Even though the top federal income tax rates were cut sharply during the 1980s, the tax revenues and the share of personal income tax paid by high earners rose during the decade. The final section in this chapter is the impact of a subsidy. So first, let's define a subsidy. A subsidy is a payment to either the buyer or seller of a good, usually on a per unit basis. The supply and demand framework can be used to analyze the impact of a subsidy as it was used to analyze the impact of a tax. As in the case of a tax, the division of the benefit from a subsidy is determined by the relative elasticities of demand and supply rather than to whom the subsidy is actually paid. When supply is highly inelastic relative to demand, sellers will drive most of the benefits of a subsidy. When the demand is highly inelastic relative to supply, the buyers will reap most of the benefits of a subsidy. So the inelastic side gets the benefit. Let's see this example. Impact of a subsidy granted to buyers Who benefits when government subsidizes college students, the student or the college? When a $4,000 per year tuition subsidy is granted to students, the demand for college shifts vertically by the amount of the subsidy. So there are going to be more students are applying for the colleges. But increase in demand increases college prices too. So the equilibrium price for college rises from P1 10,000 to P2 12,000. The new gross price for students. With the 4,000 subsidy, okay, now the students are paying 8,000 because they are getting 4,000 from the government. Compared to the previous equilibrium when they were paying 10,000, they are only getting 2,000 benefit. Okay? And what happened to remaining 2,000 of the grant? It goes to the colleges. Why? Because of the increase in prices, college gets 2,000 of the subsidy. So colleges also benefit from the tuition subsidy through higher prices for their services. There are lots of examples of real-world subsidy programs. There are now approximately 2,300 federal subsidy programs, more than twice the number of the mid-1980s. The primary beneficiaries of subsidy programs are often different than the group receiving the subsidy. For example, suppliers derive substantial benefits when the purchases are subsidized, particularly when the supply of the service is highly inelastic. When subsidies are granted to some, the elderly, the poor, certain college students, but not others, the group that's not subsidized is generally harmed because of the higher prices in the market. They often have to pay higher prices than would otherwise be the case. Two examples: subsidies to college students. Grants and loans to college students have grown substantially in recent decades. While these subsidies have helped students pay for college, they have also driven up the cost of college. Healthcare subsidies. Subsidies to healthcare consumers have driven up the cost of healthcare. Healthcare prices have risen at twice at the rate of other prices since the passage of Medicare and Medicaid. Politicians often use subsidy programs to obtain votes and political contributions from interest groups benefiting from the subsidies. The subsidies often generate harmful secondary effects. Subsidized firms are encouraged to spend more time lobbying politicians and less time pleasing customers. They are also encouraged to undertake wasteful projects that fail to generate revenue sufficient to cover costs. So this is the end of chapter 14. Thank you for watching.